So, dear guests, it's a great honor to welcome you to the keynote lecture of our fellowship meeting and workshop, Postcolonial Perspectives on Central and Eastern Europe in the context of global entanglements, here at the Pilecki-Institut, Berlin. We already had a really productive afternoon with our scholars discussing really different topics on this topic on postcolonial perspectives on Central and Eastern Europe. And now we are really glad to welcome you here for our keynote lecture. During the last year, this topic of the postcolonial perspectives became one of the main subjects within our institute that resulted at first in our successful 3-day conference in October. Maybe some of you already were here at that time visiting this event. The workshop with our scholars that is taking place today and tomorrow is the second event in this context, and we hope that more will follow. The main questions we address during our current workshops are: to what extent can postcolonial theory contribute to a deeper understanding of the complex historical and cultural entanglements of Central and Eastern Europe? And what opportunities and challenges arise when examining this region from a postcolonial perspective within global contexts? How these questions can be answered, we would like to present to the Berlin public with a keynote lecture titled The Postcolonial Challenge: Connecting Disciplines and Bridging Debates by Dr. Rachel O'Sullivan. Rachel O'Sullivan is an Irish historian and postdoc working in the Center for Holocaust Studies at the Leibniz Institute for Contemporary History in Munich. She got her PhD in 2019 at the University of Edinburgh. Her book, Nazi Germany, Annexed Poland and Colonial Rule, Resettlement, Germanization and Population Policies in Comparative Perspective, published by Bloomsbury Academic in 2023, focuses on the analysis of annexed Poland and National Socialist population policy from the perspective of colonialism. She's currently researching cultural genocide and the Holocaust. And dear Rachel, it's an honor to have you here with us, and the floor is yours.
During the Second World War, the German head of municipal building in Łódź, a major city in German annexed Poland, described how this Kolonialgebiet, colonial territory, would be turned into a living member of the German economy and the German Reich in as little time as possible. In a foreboding prediction, he added that the Colonization, or colonization, of areas that had never been German before would be conducted using uncommon methods. Frank Bayor and I, as well as other historians, have argued that colonialism, as well as its related narratives, mindsets, and rhetoric, provided a Deutungsarsenal, or an arsenal of interpretation, for historical actors during the Third Reich. Colonialism provided an easily understood prism to describe, justify, and also promote German policies and territorial expansion, not only in Poland, but in other parts of Central and Eastern Europe. Despite the clear presence of colonial referencing, challenges exist, especially in light of the specificity of Nazi violence and anti-Semitism, which was perpetrated not only within German territory, but also throughout Europe. The question of how colonialism relates to this particular part of Central and Eastern European history, and indeed the Holocaust, still very much remains. Before I get properly started, I'd like to very much thank the Pilecki-Institut, Lukas and Elizabeth, for inviting me to speak here today as part of a very important workshop and a very important meeting, Postcolonial Perspectives on Central and Eastern Europe, in the context of global entanglements. I'm really, really delighted to be here in Berlin today and to get to speak with you this evening, but to also hear my fellow workshop participants and to get to an idea of what sort of work is being done on this topic at the moment. The title of my talk, The Post-Colonial Challenge, can be understood in 3 different ways, which I'll discuss this evening. First, the academic part of the challenge refers to how post-colonial approaches can influence the way we research, write about, and discuss history, which has long been shaped by Eurocentric perspectives. How can recognizing the legacies of colonialism and imperialism, whether through examining historical power structures or processes of decolonization, questioning university curricula, or amplifying the voices of colonized peoples, help us to uncover new connections and insights within the history of Central and Eastern Europe. The second part of the post-colonial challenge is about how these academic approaches have been perceived, debated, and often met with criticism in public debates, especially in relation to the Holocaust and remembrance culture. For some, post-colonial perspectives are not seen as an opportunity to deepen understanding, but as a threat, one that could unsettle national memory and identity, and therefore should be viewed with suspicion. And this leads to the third part of the post-colonial challenge. How do those who believe in the value of post-colonial perspectives respond to those who reject them? If post-colonialism is about broadening historical understanding and integrating new viewpoints, how do we navigate the tensions it invariably creates? Using examples from my research on Annexed Poland and the Holocaust, I'll explore the first part of this challenge and some insights from applying post-colonial perspectives to this history. However, this type of research does not come without objections, so I'll explore this by highlighting 3 of these that have come from other scholars, which I have personally faced, and how my work addresses them. In the second part of my talk, I'll discuss how post-colonial approaches in academia have spilled out into public debates on remembrance culture, particularly in Germany, where discussions on the past within a diverse society are continually evolving, but also can be polarizing. Finally, I'll conclude with the third part of the challenge by raising some open questions. How can we connect disciplines more effectively? And how can we bridge the academic and public debates in a way that fosters nuanced engagement with the historical past? For over a decade, historians have debated possible similarities or continuities between European colonialism and Nazi Germany. These debates have largely focused on whether Nazi violence, particularly the Holocaust, can be understood as part of a longer tradition of violence committed by Europeans. When the Polish jurist Raphael Lemkin coined the term genocide in his 1944 book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, he initially described it as consisting of 2 phases. The first phase was the destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group, and in the second phase, the national pattern of the oppressor was imposed on the indigenous population or territory after colonization. Although the definition of genocide was modified when it was adopted by the UN as a legal term in 1948, Lemkin's unpublished works show that when creating the term, he examined not only the Holocaust, but also many cases of colonial and imperial violence. Since the late 1990s, scholars have increasingly explored links between colonialism and Nazi expansion, particularly through certain continuity theses. The historian Jürgen Zimmer, whose book is pictured here, argued in Von Windhoek nach Auschwitz that the German Empire's early 20th century violence in its colonies of Southwest Africa, today Namibia, between 1904 and 1908 influenced Nazi policies. Others, like Donald Bloxham, Dan Stone, and Dirk Moses, took a broader view, seeing both colonialism and Nazism as part of a wider European pattern of racial hierarchies and expansion. Karl P. Kegel, again, took a different approach, directly comparing Nazi expansion to the American Wild West. After some years of relative quiet, the debate on Nazi Germany, colonialism, and also the uniqueness of the Holocaust has resurfaced. While some scholars, like Stefan Klevers, question the value of comparing the Holocaust with colonial contexts, much of the recent research highlights indirect connections between the Nazi regime and colonial territories or racial states, and the Holocaust's impact on colonial and post-colonial societies. For example, Edward Kesey has explored African perspectives on National Socialism, World War II, and the Holocaust, while Ronnie Michael Ariely examined how apartheid shaped Holocaust memory in South Africa. Historians like Dimitri Abrahams, Geraldine von Freytag, and Rosa de Jong showed that the Holocaust was, in a way, always linked to colonialism. Throughout the war, for example, thousands of Jews sought refuge in places like South Africa or the Dutch colonies of Suriname and the Dutch East Indies. My research builds on this more recent scholarship by broadening the focus beyond the Holocaust itself. While earlier debates often attempted to directly compare colonial violence with Nazi violence, I take a much wider approach. Rather than viewing the Holocaust in isolation, I see it as a key part of Nazi Germany's expansionist mission. The German push into both Central and Eastern Europe was not just about violence and exclusion, but also about settlement and the assimilation or Germanization of certain population groups. Drawing on colonial history and theory, my focus is on the Reichsgau or Reich District, Vaterland, and Danzig, West Prussia, which were territories which Nazi Germany annexed immediately after the beginning of the Second World War in September 1939. My approach explores empirical parallels to colonialism by examining Nazi Germany's governance and population policies in Annexed Poland beyond the framework of Nazi ideology, and it particularly focuses on the settlement of the so-called ethnic Germans, who I'll talk about in a moment. Rather than equating different histories or searching for identical elements, my comparative analysis serves to highlight specific aspects of Nazi rule and its unique features, as well as where it fits into wider patterns. As I mentioned in my introduction, this approach does raise objections, and so I'll address 3 frequently heard in academic debates. Objection 1. So it is occasionally the case that Holocaust historians, but also other scholars, assume that colonialism is only defined by racial divisions along colour lines, with white colonisers ruling over black indigenous populations. This argument suggests that because Nazi expansion in Central and Eastern Europe did not fit this dynamic, comparisons to colonialism are not valid. However, this view overlooks the broader structures of domination, othering, and racial hierarchies that shaped both colonial and Nazi policies. While racial distinctions based on skin colour were a feature of many colonial systems, they were not the sole defining factor. We've seen a couple of examples in our workshop today, but I'm just going to highlight one that's very close to me, which is my home country, Ireland. Colonisation began in Ireland with the Anglo-Normans in the 12th century and intensified under English rule from 1536 onward, with Ireland remaining a colony until 1922. Despite both populations being white, the British systematically dehumanised the Irish, subjecting them to violence, political oppression, displacement, and efforts to erase their religion, culture, and language. And here we see some examples of how Irish people are portrayed in British print media. These perceived differences fueled British justifications for the continuation of British rule and domination, even though the Irish and British were visually indistinguishable. This colonial hierarchy did not require skin colour as a distinguishing factor. Rather, it could be based on language, accents, social status, and societal traditions. Another example showing that colonialism was not always strictly based on visible divisions is the German Empire's colony of Southwest Africa. In 1905, marriages between Africans and whites were banned. And by 1907, even the existing pre-1905 interracial marriages were annulled, stripping children from these unions of their legal status as Germans. This policy extended to anyone with even a single African ancestor, no matter how far back, meaning that individuals who had previously been considered German and white were suddenly reclassified as natives despite their skin colour. Of course, these examples cannot be equated with Nazi Germany's treatment of Jews and Poles in Annexed Poland. However, they do illustrate that skin color alone was not always a deciding factor for exclusion or indeed assimilation within colonial hierarchies. And therefore, using colonial history or colonial models to investigate Nazi Germany's rule, expansion, and violence in Central and Eastern Europe is still possible. The second objection to comparing Nazi Germany's expansion to colonialism is the assumption that, unlike many colonial powers, the Nazi regime did not pursue a civilizing or assimilatory mission. Many colonial projects were framed with so-called humanitarian goals, such as providing education and healthcare to indigenous populations, as well as efforts, both forced and voluntary, to assimilate them. This often included specific language policies, the creation of schools solely for indigenous populations, and restrictions on cultural practices, sports, and bans on certain religious practices. Many scholars argue that Nazi Germany's policies in Annexed Poland, for example, lacked these constructive or inclusive objectives. While this is certainly true for some parts of the Polish population, by applying a colonial analytical lens to Nazi rule, we can actually see multiple examples of attempts to assimilate certain population groups, challenging ideas that Nazi expansion only sought exclusion. To give an example of this, from October 1939 onwards, Nazi Germany initiated a large-scale settlement and Germanization campaign in the annexed Polish territories of the Reichsgau Wartheland and Reichsgau Danzig, West Prussia. Under the so-called Heim ins Reich, or Home to the Reich program, so-called Volksdeutsche, or ethnic Germans, were encouraged to relocate to the annexed territories. Ethnic Germans were people of German descent living outside of Germany's 1939 borders. Many came from eastern regions, such as Latvia and Lithuania, and parts of present-day Romania and Ukraine. Other ethnic Germans were already living in Poland, and Nazi Germany considered them to be stranded there due to Germany's post-Versailles Treaty territorial losses. The ethnic Germans who lived in the eastern regions were able to voluntarily apply for settlement in the annexed territories, which was only approved after strict racial and political screening. Those who were approved for settlement were allocated houses, businesses, and farms in the annexed areas. However, these properties and land had been confiscated from Poles and Jews, who were forcibly evicted. Now, despite being called ethnic Germans, many of these settlers did not originally identify as German. Their connection to Germany was often very limited, perhaps only a distant ancestor, and many only spoke Russian or Polish, with little familiarity with German culture and traditions. Therefore, a key part of Nazi Germany's inclusionary policy was Germanizing these settlers. This involved training them in aspects of German culture, agriculture, and domestic skills. Thousands of young women traveled from Germany to Poland as part of organizations such as the League of German Girls, or the BDM, or the National Socialist Women's League, the NS Frauenschaft, and they were tasked with aiding these processes. And here we see two examples of young women helping to prepare or helping ethnic German resettler families. In Annexed Poland, these young women helped the ethnic German settlers build new lives for themselves. They worked as nurses, teachers, childcare workers, agricultural assistants, or simply settlement advisors. They set up new German schools, often in former Polish school buildings. They conducted home visits. They taught ethnic German settlers and their children the German language. They organized cultural events, and they helped farmers adopt German farming techniques. Now, although these ethnic German settlers were officially classified as Germans under Nazi racial laws, the need to Germanize them contradicted this. Their treatment resembled that of a colonial assimilation effort, as they were often seen and portrayed as uncivilized outsiders rather than equal to Germans who came from Germany. This colonial-like perception is reflected in many contemporary reports. For example, a 1941 district report from Samtor, today Szamatuja near Poznan, described ethnic German settlers as having only very primitive knowledge, especially in regard to washing and household work. In post-war interviews, a Polish eyewitness recalled that Germans from Germany looked down on the ethnic Germans from Poland, while ethnic German settlers from the Baltic states were referred to as the stupid Hottentots. And so this is a word that is used in colonial contexts as well. A 1942 report further noted that the Germans in Danzig, West Prussia, treated the settlers, the ethnic German settlers, very harshly and had little to no understanding of their difficult circumstances. Meanwhile, many of the young German women who came to work in Annexed Poland often framed their Germanization work in very positive terms. They described how they felt they were making a real difference to the lives of the people they were helping to assimilate. In Danzig, West Prussia, a female settlement advisor noted that her work made her happy and that she was aware that she was making a small contribution towards making people feel at home. A kindergarten teacher recounted that the children of the settlers were gradually learning German, and that every day and every hour you could see success in the work. She wrote that it was always a great joy when suddenly another child had learned a few German words. These examples highlight how ethnic German settlers could both be included and excluded in the newly established racial hierarchy, officially recognized as German, yet often treated as inferior. This treatment, the German mindset and perceptions of the settlers, the efforts to assimilate or Germanize them, but also the attempt to justify it as something beneficial, can also be aligned with certain colonial structures. The final objection that I faced when it comes to comparing Nazi Germany's expansion and rule to colonial contexts is based on the argument by some scholars that Nazi Germany's expansion was fundamentally different from colonial rule because it aimed to eliminate population groups rather than establish a hierarchical system. Generally speaking, colonialism often functioned through a racial power structure, with the colonizers at the top and the colonized at the bottom. Now, while this may be true for some situations, colonialism has in fact taken on many different forms throughout history. For example, settler colonialism is unlike traditional colonial rule, which often relied on exploiting population groups for labor. Instead, settler colonialism seeks to replace population groups entirely, and this is through deportations, settlement, mass killing, or assimilation. The goal of settler colonialism is not just to control, but to permanently occupy, with settlers establishing themselves as the new population. As historian and anthropologist Patrick Wolfe has described, settler colonialism destroys to replace. In a settler colonial model, assimilation is also a tool of elimination because it erases the target population group's distinct linguistic, cultural, or religious identity without directly physically removing them. By viewing Nazi Germany's Germanization policies in Annexed Poland through this lens, it can be seen that, like in settler colonialism, Nazi Germany's policies of inclusion aimed at eliminating difference. Within the German pursuit of a racially homogeneous state, Germanization functioned in direct conjunction with policies of physical removal, such as deportation and murder. The historian Lorenzo Veracini, an expert on settler colonialism, has identified 26 different strategies for population removal in settler colonies. Among them, I apply 5 to Nazi expansion in Poland. And they are settler removal. This is where settlers replace the original population, creating a society with no indigenous presence. We can partially see this in Annexed Poland with the settlement of ethnic Germans. Necropolitical removal is the extermination of the targeted population, and this also applies to the violence and murder directed against Jews and Poles in annexed territories. Ethnic removal is the forced deportation of a population group. Again, this can be applied in Annexed Poland. Removal by racialization is essentially a process that could lead to either inclusion or exclusion. And so in the case of Nazi regime, they constantly categorized people into constructed racial groups, which stripped them of their actual indigeneity and assigned them to artificial categories like ethnic German or Jew, and then this then determined their fate under Nazi policies. And then finally, removal by assimilation, which I've sort of talked about, is what Veracini describes as when the targeted population is uplifted out of existence. And in Nazi Germany, we can see this apply to the Germanization of certain groups. While it's perhaps clear how these strategies individually relate to Nazi Germany's settlement, violence, deportations, othering, and Germanization, the question remains how these strategies, as an interconnected whole, could apply to the Holocaust. Undoubtedly, these removal strategies can function alone, but they also connected with one another in numerous ways. For example, Nazi Germany's policy of inclusion and assimilation for certain population groups was closely linked to the exclusion of others. The racial screening and the methods used by so-called racial experts to classify the population, for example, the ethnic German settlers, served to include or exclude people based on their supposed racial value. Similarly, by excluding certain individuals and groups, it was seen as protecting those who were being included. In practice, Jews and Poles were expelled from their homes, businesses, and land to make room for Germans and ethnic German settlers to live there. The ethnic German settlers thus directly replaced the Polish population, sometimes arriving to the vacated homes only hours after the Polish inhabitants had been evicted. Even the clothing of Jewish victims murdered in Helmno, the first extermination camp of the war, which was located in the Wartheland, was cleaned, repaired, and then distributed to ethnic German settlers. When viewed through these settler colonial strategies, the connection between Nazi Germany's settlement and Germanization policies in Annexed Poland to the policies of physical removal and murder can be better highlighted. Understanding this connection is, I believe, key to helping us see how elements of Nazi expansion and violence were not totally unique, but they can be set against broader historical frameworks of colonial expansion and rule. And I'm sure some of you are still thinking, but the Holocaust was different. And I agree. Nazi Germany did not only target Polish Jews in the annexed territories, it targeted all European Jews, including those within Germany itself. Anti-Semitism was one of the many factors that shaped Nazi ideology and, of course, the Holocaust, and we do not see this in colonial contexts. However, I'm of the firm belief that post-colonial approaches in academia do not seek to challenge the singularity of the Holocaust or make it seem in any way less important. Instead, they set elements of the Nazi regime and the Holocaust within trans-imperial and trans-historical processes, practices of othering, targeting specific population groups, assimilation, subjugation, displacement, and mass murder. By challenging approaches to Nazi Germany's expansion and violence that assume that they are in some way isolated phenomena, we can remove Nazi expansion, violence, and the Holocaust from their usual analytical framework and from National Socialist ideology, and instead draw on other types of literature, examples, and historical periods to see which aspects of Nazi rule and violence align with global patterns and which do not. Only when we adopt these new approaches, engage new experts from different backgrounds, and ask new questions can we find new answers. So I now come to the second part of the post-colonial challenge, which relates to the public sphere. This part of the challenge is not only about addressing colonial histories, but about how comparative approaches to the history of Central and Eastern Europe have been received, debated, and often resisted. In the case of Germany and the history of National Socialism, post-colonial perspectives on the Holocaust are sometimes seen not as a means to deepen historical understanding, but as a challenge to national memory and identity. Academic research on Germany's colonial history is, of course, growing. And as I previously mentioned, interdisciplinary approaches to Holocaust history are very well established in academia. However, in public discourse, these discussions often remain controversial. Over the past few years, debates about the connections between National Socialism and the Holocaust, Germany and Europe's colonial history, and their relevance to remembrance culture have intensified. Looking at recent blogs, newspaper articles, and social media posts, one might get the impression that post-colonial research approaches to the Holocaust, or comparing it to other genocides, is a radical and even provocative stance. Some portray these comparisons as a form of Holocaust relativization, rather than legitimate historical inquiry. And so you may have come across some of these articles or discussions about Holocaust memory in recent years. There's a lot of them. This is a very small example. If you Google Historiker's Streit, you'll be overwhelmed by the amount of information that comes up. What I want to demonstrate here is that this is a debate that repeatedly resurfaces in the media, often generating controversy. As a historian, I see how public discourse, particularly in these newspapers, blogs, and social media, has actually contributed to a climate of scandal rather than serious discussion. Instead of amplifying diverse perspectives, polemics have drowned out nuanced voices. The Holocaust is frequently placed on one side of the memory spectrum, while colonial history is either marginalized or excluded altogether. As Frank Bayor and I have argued, this division in public debate obscures important research on Holocaust comparisons. In my opinion, the debate about the significance of the singularity of the Holocaust in German remembrance culture has been completely over-dramatized in the public sphere. To give a personal example of how the academic and public debates do not align, in November 2022, I was invited to give a public lecture in Germany. The title of my lecture was Comparative Perspectives, Colonialism and the Holocaust in Past and Present. About 2 weeks before the lecture, the German-Israeli Society received complaints about the title of my presentation. Their complaints reached the Israeli embassy in Berlin, and they contacted the Leibniz Gemeinschaft, the research network which my institute belongs to, in what I can only assume was some sort of an attempt to intervene in my lecture going ahead. None of the people who had a problem with the title of my lecture contacted me directly. The lecture did go ahead in the end with a new title, but the main concern was that I, an academic with a PhD, several publications and collaborations, and working in Germany's leading international center for research on the Holocaust, would somehow relativize it. This example, along with the continuation of debates in the media, has made it very clear to me that there is an abundance of fear and misunderstanding when it comes to using post-colonial approaches to the Holocaust, even when trained historians are doing it. I believe that these fears and misunderstandings are largely a result of how the topic is portrayed in the media, and is one of the reasons why it keeps continually resurfacing. In recent years, I have observed at least 3 key factors that play a key role in these public debates. The first factor, the theory that the Holocaust is entirely unique and therefore incomparable is often used as a defense of Germany's existing memory culture, sometimes as a way to resist expanding remembrance to include aspects of German colonial history. Of course, the Holocaust was a singular event, just as all genocides are. Each genocide occurs in a specific historical context with its own victims, perpetrators, ideologies, and outcomes. However, not every single aspect of the Holocaust was unique. In fact, this is precisely why the concept of genocide exists as a legal and historical category, because certain patterns of mass violence repeat across different times and places. As I mentioned in my introduction, the concept of genocide was formally introduced into international law in 1948, and this largely was in response to the Holocaust. However, its creator, Raphael Lemkin, originally intended for the term to encompass a wide range of mass atrocities, including those committed in colonial and imperial contexts, as well as acts of cultural and religious destruction. History has sadly shown us that attempts to exterminate certain population groups, whether in whole or in part, through violence or other means, is not exclusive to Nazi Germany. The Holocaust, by virtue of being a genocide, is therefore comparable to other instances of mass violence, even those that have not officially been recognized as genocide. This matters when we think about remembrance culture. Public discussions in the media often emphasize the singularity of the Holocaust as the reason why it holds such a central place in German national memory. However, over a decade of academic research has demonstrated that elements of Nazi expansion, rule, and violence do align with broader global patterns. This actually suggests that the Holocaust should be a cornerstone of remembrance culture, not because it is incomparable, but precisely because it is comparable. If our goal is to preserve the memory of the Holocaust, while also using it as a tool for education, to promote tolerance and openness in society, then we must be willing to draw certain parallels. Only by doing so can we ensure that remembrance remains meaningful, relevant, and capable of fostering a deeper understanding of injustices. The second factor, Germany's strong focus on the Holocaust and its remembrance culture is not, in my opinion, inherently problematic. However, it becomes an issue when this focus is framed solely around the Holocaust's supposed uniqueness, leaving little room for other historical contexts, particularly those related to colonial history. Colonialism profoundly shaped Europe, influencing its societies, institutions, and economies. Yet critical engagement with colonial and imperial history is still largely absent from school curricula, city landscapes, museums and memorials, and also public discourse. In increasingly diverse societies, or rather in societies that are increasingly being recognized as diverse, a remembrance culture that remains Eurocentric and tied to national identity can be alienating. Not every German or every resident of Germany fully identifies with any national narrative of Holocaust remembrance, and due to different backgrounds and migration histories, some groups may relate more to other histories of oppression and violence. In my conversations with educators, teachers, and memorial site staff, I've discovered that many professionals who work directly with the public would welcome a more inclusive remembrance culture, one that acknowledges the interconnections between the Holocaust and European colonial history. However, the idea that Germany's remembrance culture cannot be expanded is largely pushed by the media and certain political rhetoric. Opinion pieces, newspaper articles, and certain radio programs tend to promote only one side of the debate, often ignoring or misrepresenting recent academic research. What we do know is that the media thrives on controversy, particularly in the digital age, where attention-grabbing headlines drive engagement, and a lot of material is available for free through websites or podcasts. Meanwhile, nuanced, peer-reviewed research on postcolonial perspectives is often hidden behind paywalls in academic journals, or, thanks to peer review, is published too slowly to keep up with media cycles. Another recurring pattern in public debates is that the experts invited by mainstream media to discuss remembrance culture are almost always well-established Holocaust historians. However, while there are some exceptions, many of these historians do not actually specialize in post-colonial or comparative approaches to Holocaust research. Additionally, the experts featured in many of these public discussions that I've highlighted tended to be overwhelmingly German. While it's understandable that Germans play a central role in discussions about their own remembrance culture, the reality is that Holocaust studies and also the related disciplines of Central and Eastern European history are highly international fields. Scholars from around the world, including many who have studied or worked in Germany, actively contribute to research on Nazi Germany, the territories which it occupied and annexed, the Holocaust, and its connections to other histories. Yet their voices are often absent from public discussions in Germany. I firmly believe to better assist knowledge transfer, we must begin to open this conversation to a wider range of perspectives. A more inclusive and globally aware remembrance culture would not only strengthen historical understanding, but also ensures that this type of remembrance remains relevant. The third factor, one of the biggest challenges in expanding remembrance culture to include intersections between European and colonial history, is what I see as the widespread lack of sometimes even basic knowledge about colonial history in Europe. As I mentioned, critical engagement with colonialism and imperialism has been largely absent from school curricula, public spaces, and media discussions. Postcolonial perspectives on the wider history of Central and Eastern European are occasionally overlooked, even though these regions experience their own forms of imperialism, oppression, and shifting rule under various empires and regimes. This is not about ranking atrocities or equating historical events, Rather, the issue is that many people do not fully grasp how colonialism, imperialism, and expansionist policies shaped not only global history, but also Central and Eastern European experiences. These regions have their own histories of occupation, forced assimilation, and cultural erasure, yet they are often left out of broader discussions. A deeper understanding of these histories is essential for meaningful discussions about their connections to not only Holocaust memory, but also the broader landscape of violence and oppression in the 20th century. And I now come to my very final part of the post-colonial challenge. And this is the part that I'm still figuring out. So I'm asking my fellow workshop participants, and also you as the audience, some open-ended questions. If post-colonialism seeks to broaden historical understanding and integrate diverse viewpoints, how do we navigate the tensions and resistance it generates, especially in public debates? Dismissing these concerns outright risks deepening divides, while avoiding difficult conversations limits the potential for meaningful dialogue. The challenge, then, is not only to present new perspectives, but to create spaces where these discussions can take place constructively. How do we encourage more open, thoughtful discussions about difficult histories without triggering defensive reactions? How can we ensure that post-colonial perspectives are seen as an opportunity to deepen historical understanding rather than as a threat? In the context of Central and Eastern Europe, where histories of empire, occupation, and shifting borders complicate conventional narratives of colonialism, imperialism, and also resistance to it, how can we engage with these complexities in a way that resonates across different communities? And crucially, how do we better transfer academic research into public debates, ensuring that scholarship contributes meaningfully to wider discussions rather than remaining confined to academic circles? So in conclusion, while I've focused on the example of the Holocaust and German remembrance culture, I believe these questions are relevant for many of us here who are working on the history of Central and Eastern Europe. The region's complex past, shaped by different empires, forced migration, and contested national identities, calls for an approach that moves beyond traditional national narratives and incorporates broader, interconnected perspectives. The memory of the past, as we know, is never just about history. It's about how societies engage with it in the present and how they shape remembrance culture for the future. Bridging the gap between academic research and public debate requires fostering a more nuanced and inclusive approach to history, one that acknowledges the interconnected histories of Central and Eastern Europe, colonial legacies, and the shifting nature of national and collective memory. Expanding the conversation is not about diminishing the significance of any one historical event, but also ensuring that remembrance remains relevant, inclusive, and meaningful. The post-colonial challenge is not only about re-examining our understanding of history or our perception of remembrance culture as citizens, scholars, journalists, politicians, or educators. It's also about challenging ourselves. It requires us to critically reflect on the narratives we have been brought up with, the educational systems we've gone through, and the frameworks through which we interpret the past. By embracing post-colonial perspectives, I hope we can move beyond rigid, compartmentalized views of history and develop a more dynamic, interconnected understanding that can help us navigate both the challenges of the past and the present. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Rachel, for your, yes, please take a seat. Thank you for a fascinating lecture and your really interesting points. I myself enjoyed it a lot, and I can really relate to lots of the points you said. But now I'd like to open the discussion to the public. Are there any questions or comments from your side? Yeah, say something there.
Hi, thank you so much. It was a great talk. I really enjoyed it, and I myself am exposed to the postcolonial and decolonial talks and research, mostly from the legal perspective, international law, human rights, critical legal studies, and during those talks, sometimes the question of the distinction between imperialism and coloniality surface, and I still cannot fully understand if we can actually claim that whatever is happening in the empires, if there is no clear racial element, it can still be considered colonialism. For example, there was one talk of Tina Tsuvala, who is one of the prominent legal scholars, talking about Marxist theory as applied to colonialism, basically. And when I asked her, okay, when we talk about, for example, Ukraine and Russia, there is no clear outside external vision of one race subjugating another race. However, we know the denigrative narrative about the Ukrainians who are less capable than Russians, they're stupid, they're this and that is very similar to the narrative that is constructed by the imperialist and colonial rule, and we all know that basically racism is socially constructed, so there is not a particular skin color that should be actually analyzed by the researchers. However, when we are discussing this with Global South colleagues, it's very hard to explain to them this relationship, which is not necessarily the purely racial in the classical perspective, but in essence, it's the same power dynamics and subjugation of one nation of the other. So I'm wondering, as you mentioned, one of these arguments, basically one drop of the blood argument that is making your point stronger, but also revoked in my mind, what is then about those nations that are very similar, even in the cultural sense, but still there is this oppression going on. Is this only imperialism, or can we also argue for colonialism, and then how can we prove it? Thank you.
That's a very big question. A lot of your points that you raised actually touch on some things that we were talking about in the workshop today, about these different power structures as I see them, existing not only along racial lines, but also...
It's muted.
That's better. Yeah, some discussions that we were having today in the workshop, the extent to which these power structures don't only necessarily function along racial lines, but can also function along different things like social class, language, different traditions, religion. I'm not a historian of colonialism and imperialism, so what I would say is, in my research, I think it's just important not necessarily that we hold on too tightly to these definitions, rather that we look at the ways that they are flexible, in fact. Because what we know from colonial history and imperial history is that it functions in different ways. So you have a classic example of, let's say, the British Empire, which we call it imperialism. But if you look at a situation like Ireland, it's argued, well, is Ireland a colony or not? And I sit here today with a surname that is an anglicized version of an Irish surname, and I grew up only speaking English at home, yet we still have our Irish culture, and we're white, and we integrated into the European, let's say, system. We're seen as kind of good Europeans, but everything about our history is actually telling us something different about ourselves. So I think it's maybe a bit of a wide and very unclear answer, but I think in a way it's actually about embracing those different parts, because it's only when we actually start highlighting these sort of gray areas that we can really highlight the impact of these things. You know, if we always had just moved along the assumption that colonialism is this, imperialism is this, colonialism functions through color lines, well then we're still coming at it almost from, I mean, this older, I guess, a Eurocentric perspective to it in a way. So that's a long answer and a potentially an unclear one, but that's at least how I deal with these sort of inconsistencies almost across the different examples.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for this wonderfully illuminating and well-structured talk. I have a rather simple question, which I maybe must explain later. What is Michael Rothberg doing differently? It is my impression, I have of course not looked into all comments about his theory of multidirectional memory, encompassing postcolonial and Holocaust dimensions. But it is my impression that it is less contested than the books which you listed. Is this because his concept is rather normative in the field of memory politics and not factual history? Or what is your idea why such a structurally similar approach gets along with less protest?
Thank you for the question. I think it depends on who you ask with Michael Rothberg, because when his book was translated into German, it did cause a sort of flurry of scandal in the German media that wasn't seen when the book came out in English. But I do think that and I mean, he actually does feature in a couple of these blog posts or newspaper posts, again, not so prominently as I would say German historians do, and he's often sometimes sort of thrown, you know, maybe he aligns with it himself, but also sort of along the same lines of Dirk Moses, and like almost like portrayed as a more sort of an extreme sort of approach to memory culture, which, as you rightly said, in certain circles it's not seen like that at all. I do think that some parts of his thesis, this idea that essentially that memory isn't a zero-sum game, so that means that remembering one thing doesn't necessarily cancel out the memory of anything else. I do think it works better in memory studies because, as you said, it's based on a lot more. I mean, how I see memory studies is, especially when we're talking about remembrance culture today, is again, it's flexible, it's developing, it's changing, it's taking in different parts from discussions. Whereas when we're looking at something like the example of Annexed Poland, you know, I only have my sources to look at. Like I can of course bring in these debates, I can bring in potential trends of what people are looking at, but ultimately it has to be based on some sort of empirical evidence, or else I can't stand up and defend my work, basically. So I think Michael Rothberg has maybe tapped into something that I see as sometimes it's not always that well elaborated in these sort of public debates on remembrance culture, which is how do we define remembrance culture, actually? Because it doesn't, this term Erinnerungskultur doesn't really exist in English language speaking. Like it's a thing in Germany that's almost like this really defined concept, but we know culture, it's very hard to define culture, and especially today when we have, you know, you don't only have a newspaper article, you also have an article online, you have the comments underneath, you have Facebook, you have Instagram, you have Twitter, and they're all also contributing to culture. So in a way, I think that Michael Rothberg can contribute actually very well to this debate in bringing a bit more of this, I guess, less empirically based evidence into it, more or less.
I must admit I'm not quite sure what your point really is. What is the singularity of the Holocaust? It is not that it had similarities with colonial. It is not that they wanted to kill parts of people, that they wanted to deport a part or at a whole. The singularity of the Holocaust is that they wanted to exterminate Jews up to the last individual, systematically, because they thought that Jewry is the world enemy. And this is the singularity of the Holocaust. And my question is, what exactly helps you to understand the Holocaust better if you compare it to very different kinds of what exactly should help us to understand the Holocaust better, and the other way around. What makes you understand colonial oppression and extinction or whatever, if you, in a kind of fixation, constantly trying to compare it to the Holocaust. What is behind that? Behind that is that they want to insinuate or suggest that colonial oppression is not being beachtet, recognized because of Holocaust memory. That's the toxic point in this debate. The insinuation that German colonial history is not being properly looked at or whatever, because there's the fixation on the Holocaust. That's the toxic argument. And I asked myself, how do you differentiate from this toxic political attack on the singularity of the Holocaust?
Thank you for your question. I mean, your first question is, in a way, how do we understand the singularity of the Holocaust better through comparing it? It's because we only know about singularity through comparison. That's the only way we can do it. Like, to say it's singular, we have to compare it to something. That's the way it works.
Yeah, but the insinuation is that this does not happen. The insinuation is this does not happen, and that's not true. But you say it's not happening enough, or it's not happening in a proper way, or whatever. But it's not true that Holocaust research does exclude all comparison. That's not true.
That's what I was trying to say with my presentation. The academic debate allows a lot more room for this discussion. The public debate does not. And that's what I firmly believe as, okay, I'm not a German, I didn't grow up here, I've lived here for 10 years. However, I've experienced it myself. I tried to give a presentation in German in Germany. It was actually my first presentation in German in Germany, and immediately someone complained about just the title. No one contacted me directly to ask me what it was about. They immediately went to higher levels, up to my employer, and I received just numerous forwarded emails, never actually finding out who made the initial complaint. I did, however, find out that they had read some of my publications. If you were to read my publications, I very clearly state that I'm not trying to relativize the Holocaust. I'm not trying to question the singularity. I'm using my right to academic research and freedom of academic research in Germany. I've been trained to do this. And so I think this idea that on one side, yes, there is freedom, and it's getting more popular, I would say, in Holocaust research to use these different disciplines. And this is only one. The colonial perspective is, of course, only just one research approach that we would use. There's, of course, gender. There's numerous different ways that you can approach this. And it does bring in examples from other different theories, literature, etc. The colonial one is, let's say, popular at the moment. But when I say at the moment, it's been going on since 1948. Raphael Lemkin, in his definition of genocide, mentioned colonization in his initial definition. So it's been going on for a long time. On one hand, in the academic debate, we can talk about it a lot more. The public debate is not constantly, but it is more likely to be shut down in a way. And you mentioned this sort of idea of the insinuation that colonial history, for some reason, that colonial history isn't as well remembered or known about because of the Holocaust. That's not my argument. Because if you look at colonial history, for example, in Britain, where I did my PhD, they don't talk about imperial violence. They don't talk about colonial history. Like, so it's not only Germany who doesn't talk about colonial history. It's Europe. It's America. And it's only recently that we're sort of really breaking down these structures, and we're looking at school curricula and we're looking at university curricula, and we're saying, well, where can we do better, or where we can bring in these new perspectives? And so I think I don't see the Holocaust as a reason why this history hasn't been explored. I think that's, if we look at any other country, we can see it there too.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Wonderful presentation. And I'm curious about how your work was even connected to the Holocaust in the first place. Because of course, the German occupation of Poland, of Western Poland, of the territories that were annexed into the Reich is related to the Holocaust. There is no question about that. But your book is not exactly about what we conventionally understand as the Holocaust, and yet you keep being dragged into these very heated debates. So I wonder how this has happened in the first place.
That's a very good point. My book doesn't directly focus solely on the Holocaust, and there's a reason behind it, and that is because I see the Holocaust as part of this expansionary mission. It's facilitated through this expansion. As I mentioned in the presentation, the first extermination camp is at Helmno, and that's the Reichsgau-Wartheland. So it's in the exact same area as they're mass settling ethnic Germans. And so the two are always working in parallel in a way. And they're feeding into each other too. As I mentioned too, like this idea of population exclusion and removal facilitates then the inclusion of other parts of the population. And why I get drawn into these debates more so on the Holocaust and remembrance culture, I mean, the first article I wrote, I think I said very clearly that this isn't a continuity thesis. I'm not arguing what Jürgen Zimmer argues. And I think like 10 different people tweeted about my article and said, a new continuity thesis. I said, and I don't know if people don't read what I'm saying, that maybe they just see the word continuity thesis and think that this is another one. But I'm not trying to do that. So I think it's potentially a mixture of things. Also, I mean, I do work at the Center for Holocaust Studies. However, I have always come into my work there saying that I do have a different background because I use this imperial colonial approach. Yeah, I mean, that's the short answer in a way. I guess my research touches on the Holocaust, it touches on postcolonialism, it brings it together with settlement and Germanization, and at the moment, postcolonialism is a topic that's not only been discussed in Germany, but also globally, and so, yeah, here I am today.
So, yeah.
I wanted to say thank you for this presentation. Myself, coming from Eastern Europe, I find this very important, and I would hope to see this more in the public and not being exclusive within the academia. I have two much shorter questions. One is, you mentioned a book that mentions 26 strategies of settler colonialism, right, that you applied. Question is very simple. Could you please repeat who wrote it, where to find it? Because I would really love to also see it. And secondly, you mentioned that your research and your presentations were met with some, let's say, objections in Germany, let's call it like this. I wonder how was it received in Poland, if you had an occasion to present it in Poland. And yeah, these are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. The book is Lorenzo Veracini, and it is called, I believe, Settler Colonialism, A Theoretical Overview. It's quite a short book, but he's actually written, I believe he's the editor of Settler Colonial Studies, so there's also a whole journal dedicated to settler colonialism as almost a separate topic to standard colonialism, basically. And then how has my research been received in other places? I mean, I would say actually to give Germany maybe the benefit of the doubt, usually it's okay in Germany. Generally speaking, I've had good experiences. In Poland, when I've presented, or actually in other, because as I mentioned, Holocaust Studies is very international, in any other countries, I haven't received any sort of backlash, as it were. I mean, within academic settings, of course, you get academic questions, you get academic criticism, and some are correct, maybe some are not so correct, but that's the way it goes. But I would say, by and large, certainly Poland, or at least the engagements I've had with Polish scholars have always been very positive. The Pilecki-Institut has invited me here today. I was also recently at another Postcolonial Perspectives conference in Krakow in October, and so I would say, generally speaking, at least from my perspective, and I can't speak for everyone, it has been positive.
So, any other questions? Rachel, maybe then I ask a question to you. Maybe I have to give some contextualization why I'm asking this question. So, it's maybe an example from my everyday work here at the Pilecki-Institut. I'm working in the education department, very often with pupils, mostly from Berlin or Brandenburg, but from all over Germany too. And I'm doing this for many years. So just before I started working here, I worked in this field. And what I experienced in that work with German students from school, with a really diverse German society, is exactly that what you mentioned in your talk, that the remembrance culture, mostly how it is working right now, needs more points where people can relate. Or we have to offer them some fixed points in our history where they can relate. And positive experience from my work here in Pilecki-Institut, with the topics we are dealing with the history of Witold Pilecki, of Auschwitz, of the persecution of Polish people, so also non-Jewish Polish people, is that not only make the fixation on one group of victims just to spread, is more, it makes it easier to relate for the diverse German school students. So it doesn't depend if they are just German-born, if they have Turkish parents or Arab parents, or Ukrainian, Russian, Polish parents. It doesn't matter. It makes it just more, better understandable what National Socialism is and how the Holocaust could happen. That's for me one point why I had the intention to bring this topic here together with my colleague Elisabeth in the Institute. The other side of this is I rarely experienced approaches like this in other German memorial sites or in German historical political education at all. So I don't know if you have different experiences or if you are in touch with memorial sites and with educational programs. If you have maybe an idea out of your research how this topic could be more visible in this area in German.
Yeah, that's a great question. I do have quite a bit of contact with different actually heads of memorial sites. And I do think some of them are trying to bring it in some way, in some sort of nuanced way. It's often the question of expertise and also money. There was a big debate in Germany about this Ministry of Culture Rahmen's concept for Erinnerungskultur, where the idea was sort of put forward to try and I guess, a bit more of an official expanding of remembrance culture, and that was actually met with a lot of resistance from a lot of memorial site heads of memorial sites or directors. And I actually know some of them, and I think really the reason, I think that it was framed in different ways, but I think truly part of it was this concern about finances. Because I have been invited to other memorial sites or other conferences with more so educators. For example, the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung, I was on a trip with them to Israel as well. So expanding this out, but yeah, again, the question is expertise and the question is money. One thing that I also have to mention is the German academic system itself is quite limiting. I don't know if people know, but you have 6 years after your PhD to more or less find a permanent job, or else you can't be employed temporarily anymore. And this makes it quite hard actually for non-Germans coming into this system, because it means you're always sort of, there's a clock counting down. So I'm sure a lot of academics would like to do a lot more work with memorial sites, with education, with educators. The question is, how much time do you have to do your postdoc project, and if you can find a permanent job in that time. So unfortunately, the system sometimes works against cooperation, but I'm hopeful for the future.
Thank you. So, a last call to the audience if there are any questions. Don't see anyone, so then, oh, one.
Sure. Yeah. I can speak loud. First of all, thank you very much for your lecture. I think it was very simple and it showed us very clear ideas you have, and it's easy to relate about memorial sites. I have a different, I'm not from academia, but my experience in Germany with memory sites run by German institutions, it's really difficult because they are very exclusive. They do not open their doors to anybody apart from their friends and themselves. And I'm not talking about subjects, about which historical subject should we talk about or what should we include. But, yeah, well, you have to be invited by a German friend to be able to get in there. Otherwise, nobody will listen to your voice. I'm not German, so nobody listens. I knock, they don't listen, so yeah. So we speak somewhere else, but it's really, really difficult. Maybe you have an idea how to, is there a way for German memory institutions to be open to different people, maybe different like non-scholars or artists or women or migrants or Polish women? There's quite a lot of us which knock constantly. Is there any idea who has the key or where can I find it?
That's a good point. I'm trying to think. Whenever I've talked at any sort of more sort of public institutions, I was invited by someone. Normally it's the case that I knew someone through someone. There are certain conferences where I guess people from different industries, if you like, not just from academia, but also from more the educational side or memorial side are invited. And so I think networking is one of the ways, but it's still not easy. And it reflects sometimes also a little bit of the German academic system, at least with Holocaust studies. For example, there's only 1 or 2 professor positions for Holocaust studies in Germany, like a Lehrstuhl. Like Holocaust studies essentially falls under contemporary history. And what's often the case in German academia is certain Lehrstuhl or these departments in a way. People all know each other because they've come through the BA together, they've come through the masters together, they do their PhD and they stay within it. So I see kind of similar things in a way that people do know each other. I wish I had an easy answer for you. Maybe we can discuss it afterwards and come up with a plan. But yeah, I mean, public discussions also always help. So.
Okay, then if there aren't any more questions, thank you again, Rachel, for the fascinating lecture again and for your really interesting and fascinating answers. To the audience for coming, listening, and asking interesting questions. So let's close this day, come to an end, and I wish everyone a nice evening. And you're. Wait, I just need to check. There's some wine outside. I don't know if this is just for the scholars or for all. My colleague Elisabeth is just not. She had to go, I think. So if there's enough, I think it's for. All right. Thank you all. And